Torkwase, if you could state your full name and your preferred pronouns for us.
Torkwase Dyson. She, her.
Perfect. Last night when we talked, we mentioned the move between what you came to Bennington intending to do, and once here in the site, what you found to be illuminating for you. And I wonder if we could start our conversation there with you reframing that moment for our attention and for the audience here.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, for coming and welcoming me so graciously. And I want to give a special thanks to my dear friend Anne, who is also my classmate from Yale, and that's how we know each other. So we've known each other a very long time. And it was really gracious of her to ask me to share my work with you all. So thank you, Anne. I'm not sure where she went.
Right here.
Oh, can we get Anne? I really appreciate it. So when you asked me that last night and wanted to talk about my sort of journey here, it was initially with Anne asking me to think about the history of this place and all its various aspects, and Helen Frankenthaler, also the kind of move that she made doing work at Bennington, and I came and I stumbled in the archive upon some Tony Smith work that he had done here, produced here, and I was interested in sort of the way in which Tony Smith had used the space to sort of self-assign and build a temporary modular architectural piece on the grounds, and that sort of took over my senses, both the sculpture itself, but also his insistence on creating work in this sort of testing process vein, right? How do institutions allow you to create work in process, take chances, and be in a practice that's continuously evolving. So that's what I wanted to do here at Bennington. So I took up a part of Tony's framework where he gives an assignment, he answers the assignment, and he exhausts the possibility of that assignment. So when I was here, I just thought about that both in relationship to geometry, both in relationship to a sort of the abstraction in relationship to the history of mathematics and shape, and explored that from there.
Thank you. For those who are not native to Bennington College and to kind of the persons, places, and languages of minimalist and post-minimalist art, I want to just kind of highlight a couple of things that Torkwase has just shared with us about the practice of Tony Smith and his 1961 Bennington structure. And modular, a series of kind of modular forms about almost 40 feet, I believe, in diameter, that was installed here on the grounds, with these tetrahedron-like, parallelogram-like openings. One could think of it as almost kind of like a beehive, as humans might build one, a nexus of this creative possibility. And as Torkwase has just beautifully said, and I'll come back to this phrase, almost exhausting the possibility of a shape, right? This idea of a structural form, a human architecture, spatially designed to exhaust itself. Yeah? Think about that for a moment. That beautiful, almost rendering of making something as formal and as solid, for lack of a better term, as a shape, of making it disappear. And then later, last night, we were talking about almost an ancillary work that Tony Smith made, Smoke. And could you describe a little bit in your own words, Torkwase, the magic of Smoke?
Well, it's, we were talking about smoke earlier, and So the tetrahedron project, you saw it enthroned, and then it ended and stretched itself into smoke, right? So what's so kind of wonderful about that shape in itself in relationship to the pyramid, in relationship to other artists, and where we see this shape take up space, is a fascination to me. But when I understood smoke to be, again, exhausting that form between architecture and sculpture, between, place and space, but creating these sort of throughways that I would argue is a form in itself that holds both a comprehension and a kind of magnificent space of the incomprehensible. So it's that tension between the sort of constructed, the measurable, and the incomprehensible, and the spiritual, in a sense, transcendental. So I'm interested in that practice, that framework, as a person in the world. So when I experience it, I see it, I talk, I think about it, and it's a place of value for me, as a person who tries to exercise geometries to different ends, but one that tries to exercise geometries in a way that really gets to a kind of visceral moment for myself and the viewer.
I love that sense of exercising geometries, because it is a kind of sacred geometry, isn't it? This kind of this transcendental growing out of and becoming more than what the shape initially allowed. So I will be honest, I knew there was such a thing as a Tony Smith called smoke. And I felt like I had seen it, maybe at LACMA sometime, but I didn't remember it. And I went online and I saw it last night, and it is breathtaking. So if you can imagine the Bennington structure of 1961, this modular series of tetrahedron-like forms, creating this nexus of human spatial engineered beehive. And then imagine 40, 50 years later, after his death, in 2005, it is manufactured no longer from concrete, but from black steel, and it rises up, right? And the sense of then the transcendental nature of materiality, aping and becoming invisible, and yet so essential as air, as breath, as smoke. It is a fundamental footnote in the history, not only of American art, but in postmodern form. And that, I think, that beautiful interweaving and transcending of form is something that you have absolutely given us in Scalar. And the title of this body of new work that I find both evocative and generous. And so I wonder, what does that term, scalar, what work is it doing for you as we think then about your attending to Tony Smith's legacy here at Bennington, attending to his playfulness and his transcendence for your own work? What does this term scalar help us see as we move through into your new practice?
Scalar is a term that I've recently become familiar with in relationship to the politics of human geography, right? And how sort of scalar systems of both international trade, ideas of growth and magnitude of space and place, positioning of individuality in relationship to infrastructural and kind of hyper-built spatially conditions. So Scalar allows allows a space for me to think both vertically but also horizontally. And it doesn't, for me, just sit in a kind of perception of the vertical, but it also sits in the perception of the horizontal as I think about different ways in which the politics of human geography sort of unfold over time. So the practice is much about is using constructed language to get at the history of a particular kind of construction, and then I go after that, right? So oftentimes I'll take a phrase from a field that's not my own, and then I'll set it, and then I'll go after it. So it's a really, like most of my, so people that I'm really interested in, it's a way to understand a kind of particular field of knowledge and make it sort of bend to a kind of history of painting, sculpture, drawing, and performance. So that's the work that it's doing. It's a sort of beacon to understand what it means to sit in a contemporary ecology that has multiple points and understand it's not distance, but it's magnitude.
I think that's so beautiful, that term magnitude, right? And thinking about scalar as a quantity that has no direction in and of itself, like temperature or speed, right? Which are different than, say, a vector, which is rising or falling, like if we were to say velocity, right? And so that sense that you're saying, it helps you to think both horizontally and vertically. It helps you feel that space, transcend that space, transcend beyond what's on the gridded sheet. And thus, both shape and language are grounded, but they get to play. Yeah? One of the interesting things as you're speaking is I'm reminded of how deeply rooted your practice is in, I won't even say the recovery, because it's not a recovery, and I won't say the indisputed, because of course it is disputable, but that doesn't mean it's not true, but the histories and the multiple ecologies of displaced bodies, of displaced persons, of people who have been told over time, this is not a place for you, this is not a space for you. And so I love that Scalar and the works as you've made them, thinking about Tony Smith, thinking about this place, allows you to really dig in and kind of hop from hole to hole, as we were saying about, yeah, the ways in which such an incredible accumulative practice such as yours can really be invested and rigorous about the language that you're tracking. Yeah? I would love to ask, for you, in your practice, when do you know it's time to shift or move to another project? Or when do you know that a series has served you well and it's time to move to other forms, other materials, other scales, to go bigger, to transcend more?
So we were out last night having food, and Horace graciously asked me that same question, and I'm going to sort of take up the space of the metaphor right now and say that my work, and I'll just share it with you all what I shared with Horace, and that is my practice is a kind of like me on the ground crawling from hole to hole, right? And so like a project sort of occupies these different holes and in this sort of beautiful way. And I'm crawling from hole to hole. Some of, and I look in the hole and I see what's in the hole and I get it and I take it and I use it. And I crawl to another hole and I get it and I take it and I use it. So the practice for me is, the projects are these holes, right, that I look into, I make the work, I research around the work, and then when I think that I've got it, I leave it and go to another hole. And so sometimes that is directional, sometimes it's linear, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes I have to go back to another hole and look again. or something has been put in that hole, so it changes the condition. So it's a matter of understanding my own embodied, both embodied and sort of cognitive knowledge around whatever is in that hole. And then how do I take that information and make it into an art experience so I can actually understand the breadth of both the movement from hole to hole, but actually what was in the hole. So the art objects are those sort of indexes of both the crawl and the looking. Do you know what I mean? So that's what I just kind of sets out. But it's the main kind of awareness of knowing that when I think, and a good friend of mine talks about this, sometimes, Andres L. Hernandez, sometimes you end a thing, but it's not finished, right? So I'll end a project, but that doesn't mean it's finished, so I may have to go back. So lots of endings, sometimes some failures, sometimes some things that are not quite resolved. But I still have to move on to then go back to that condition, so to remake the work.
Oh, this is so good. So I can move in two different ways, and one of them, just where you ended, was as I was looking at the leaflet and the program of the work she made, I was delighted, and I would say quite enchanted and pleased to see Water Table come back and surface again in your mind. And we might talk about this a little later, but many of you probably know Torkwase's great ongoing series, Water Table. And I'd love to talk at a later point, but correct me if I'm wrong, and I might be, but these are the first references in the series of Water Table that are tondos. And that made me really excited, the round ones. Usually they're like 30 by 60 or 60 by 60 parallelograms, and to see tondos for that series is really exciting. And so I would love, before we move on, to see if you have anything to share or to say about that particular move, that particular crawl to that shape.
So yeah, that was a particular move. I was thinking about the relationship of pipelines and the different kind of ways pipelines both exist in the earth and through the earth. And I was thinking, about the circle as a hypershape, meaning that circle, that kind of shape is, proliferates a certain kind of environmental, both health and catastrophe. So that shape is now a kind of signifier of both danger, colonization, recolonization, hoarding, extraction. So thinking about the circle, and I used mostly rectangular shapes to express what is this Water Table series, but I wanted to deal in thinking about a kind of shape language that was not representation, but was about objectness. So the history of painting and the objectness of a kind of knowledge, right, between image and object. So thinking about the circle in relationship to pipelines without, in their objectness in relationship to the geographic kind of condition in which pipelines exist across the world. So I'm always thinking when there's a new pipeline or an old pipeline or a pipeline on a truck or a pipeline in the and through a community, what's running through that space. So it gave me a sort of object to play with that was one a hypershape, but also a space where I could play with and think about liquidity. So it gave me a sense of both image of liquidity and objectness at the same time, and that kind of tension around it.
Earlier in our conversation, I mentioned the term accumulation, and I just wanted to kind of flag for those who are really invested in Torkwase's process to see this is the moment of accumulation. Does that make sense? Where the shape, right, has a liquidity, a capacity, it has a transitional and transcendent ability to accumulate more to itself than being just representative objectness shape, right? It accrues all of these meanings over time in multiple disciplines so that when you approach the work, it's an index of the ways in which this shape has mutated and morphed through human civilization, right? And all of that is what Torkwase holds when she's thinking about shape, building, framing, stretching. Does that make sense?
This guy.
This one. It's so wonderful, and that is beautiful. And I'm going to ask you one more time, if you would, to kind of connect these dots, because you, for me, were one of the first contemporary artists and one of the foremost to really invest in the difficult yet important work of the epistemological ecologies of the Anthropocene, right? To really help us understand the circle, the earth, the very short amount of time that humans have been on the earth, the very short amount of time that we have been sentient and able to control weather patterns, but then from that short amount of time, the magnitude of our effect on the earth. And you were one of the first artists to not only name and speak and write about that, but to, without walking, connect that to racial ideologies of removal, black abstraction, and to also think about spatial engineering and architectural space. And I'm wondering if you would do us the honor of just kind of connecting those dots for us one more time. How is it that for you, those things can all come in and out of this new kind of diagrammatic language that you're building?
Well, I'm like, am I doing that? Did I just, is that happening? That in itself feels like a lot, you know. And maybe I'm doing it, and I'll let you be the one to say that. But what it feels like to me is a kind of agency and understanding, for me specifically through the language of painting, as my primary kind of source for knowledge production, is a way in which how we got to something like Katrina, how we got to, you know, something like the Dakota Pipeline catastrophe, and how those things are, for me, really markers in my own kind of experience in being a human on the planet, right? So all of these things that you talk about are me really simply trying to understand how we got here and acknowledge that the way in which these things have been taught to me have been sort of piecemeal, right? They have not been necessarily networked together, and they have not necessarily been taught in a way that these are things that are just inextricably bound. And the work for me is to understand that to be truth, that all of these things are constructed, and that boundness is a kind of space where I go to give myself sort of assignments to not to unbind those connections, but to take them as something bound and take it as the density as it is, to take it as the foreverness that it is, to take it as the magnitude, you know, that it exists in, and not try to distill it, but definitely tried to understand the ways in which these things continue to be connected, right? To not leave a thing behind. And for me, painting, in the history of painting, and movements like constructivism, now I'm thinking of that moment of, you know, the immediate built environment, the where we have our bodies as an art form, and we talked about this last night, that then what is that relationship to these sort of post-war forms, what are post-war technologies and industries? At that time, how do those lend themselves to our climate condition, right? And how artists were thinking about those very political things. Malevich, that was the Black Square is a very political move, right? So how to think about these conditions of making and how they lend themselves right now to what is being, we're still trying to figure out that language around the Anthropocene. But what, as a painter, what am I doing with that legacy, or what am I doing with that interest around built environments, around different kinds of wars, around different kinds of nationalisms, around different kinds of militarizations, right? So the work for me is thinking about our history and through the lens of its responsibility and connection to not only climate change, but the history of environmental liberation and justice, right? So this project, it has structures just like race has a structure, just like, you know, class has structures, just like environments have structures, just like nature has a structure. So for me, the practice is, you know, is this me trying to build these structures to understand these things that are bound. And I think painting is a perfect way to really take on those histories, because it was so a part of those histories too, in a very radical way. So that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know if that answers your question, because it's not like I'm trying to do those things or trying to let the things I'm thinking through. So.
Thank you. Could we turn to kind of put the work that we're seeing upstairs in the gallery in concert with some of the other extraordinary work that we've done? And I'm thinking primarily of the Studio South Zero. And if you could kind of explain to us what that project is, and it's tied to the Winter Wells Drawing School, would be really helpful in thinking through how you're working through and using the language and the tools of painting to prototype and experiment to bring people around these issues.
So Studio South Zero was, I'll just give you a brief history of how I landed on modular architecture and ideas of mobility. In that, when I finished graduate school and I was in the world, I hadn't really got to a place where I knew what the project of painting could do. So I left the project of painting for a while and started thinking about solar energy, started thinking about history of modularity, you know, Fuller's work, and which also Tony Smith clearly is thinking about, in terms of his work at Bennington also, but further, to find a space where I could think about solar energy and the collecting of solar power and the distribution of solar power, right? So these kinds of systems of diverse energy distributions I've really gotten into, and the thing where I could practice that new information turned out to be architecture, right? So architecture sort of fell into a place where, people stand on a thing, people stand in a thing, and then the thing they stand on and then the thing they stand in then they could access this energy. So it became a kind of host for another kind of learning, this thing called architecture. And then I was doing this, and I was trying to do this, saying, no, we need to think about energy distribution and semi-autonomy and things like this, but I couldn't get the architectural thing right. I could hire a solar company to come in and build a solar bank and bring it in, and everybody would kind of understand the science behind that, but I could not figure out how to tell someone how to build the architectural structure that I needed to do. Then I needed to place the solar systems on. So it was frustrating to me working with different architects and different people who were interested in architecture, and I got hit with, no, you cannot use this language, but this means this, and you don't know what you're talking about, and I'm not sure, and all of these kinds of roadblocks that were put in front of my idea. And maybe it was because of my body politic, or maybe they were just exhausted from the day. Either way, they I wasn't under a system where someone could tell me, these are the things that you're not supposed to know. These are the people who should know it, and they should just follow what you say and figure out the answer. So I didn't have that kind of interiority at the time. So to get that interiority, to get that kind of knowledge, I want this cantilevered, I want this balanced, I want this wind load taken care of, I want this kind of distribution of weight. All those things, I've learned the language of architecture in a very basic way. So going about my life, teaching myself architecture, architectural drawing, architectural rendering, perspective, hinges, all these things. And it dawned on me after Katrina that I could, when the levees broke, right, because architecture comes with engineering oftentimes in the best of practices. When I saw the film, I could imagine the levees, because now I had that language of engineering and architecture, so I understood how pressure worked against water, how force worked. So the physicality of these kind of contemporary catastrophes, I could now understand what it meant, what the political space of a civil engineer. So to cut this story short, when I understood, I was like, wait a minute. It's like when you find $1 in your pocket that you didn't know was there. It's like, wait, oh my goodness. Wait, and I just wanted to just stop the world and say, wait a minute, this levee business. So then I was looking at Niagara Falls. So it was this whole sort of effect from a skill that I learned. Everything opened up. And then I said to myself, I realized that there were architects that were just conceptual. Like the space to conceptualize a thing, never to be built. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Then Elmina, the enslaved castle, came to mind. The levees came to mind. All of these things of architectural consequence around Black being had now become into question. Like, how did it get here? How did it get constructed? Whoa, that was with so much intention. So then I had a place to exercise that new knowledge. And painting was perfect for it. Because I could paint, but most people, it's like, people disagree with me when I say this, but I think so many people can paint. I think that you can learn how to paint, in my mind. Maybe because I love painting so much, I think, no, you can do it. If you can see, if you can't see, anybody can be a painter. But that doesn't necessarily mean I was making anything remotely interesting. So, or remotely towards something that would get me a kind of broader intelligence of what was going on in the world. So I turned that to painting. So that's what happened. It's like Studio South Zero is just a mechanism to help me become a better painter. It allows, it's not mine anymore, I've donated it, but all of these things are only set in a position so that I can make paintings, so that I can understand these larger things with a greater kind of embodied knowledge, right? So Tony makes sense for me. It's like, oh, okay, design, architect, making these things to make sense of these things. something that's inadequate about American architecture. So I go to the Egyptians and I go to Japan and I think about these things. So that's what it is. Studio South Zero is just a tool for me to understand these other things. Now, I think I use the least, out of everybody who's operated and been in it. But it's just a thing to help me make better paintings, if that makes sense. That's as clear as I can say it right now. It takes me through these geographic sites. It allows me to have a studio and live out a kind of mobility, and a mobility that is by choice, not by force. It also allows other people, I can invite other people to think about their fields of knowledge in it. So then I index all of that lived experience and put it in painting and drawing and sculpture. So it's an assignment for me. It's a tool for me to get at all these other, get at another level of comprehension and orientation to the planet. So it helps with that. I think people are supposed to be mobile. We're supposed to move freely. I think borders are constructed. We're supposed to be able to live in somewhat of a commons. But it's different when it's forced through human-induced climate change. It's different when it's forced through, the transatlantic slave trade. It's different when it's forced between, idea of race cleansing. It's like that's different than the free rights of humans to move across geographies, sharing their lives with us. I think I went on a tangent. I'm not sure.
No, that was
but
so
I'm
good.
still, it's so new. All of this is so new. So.
Yeah. No, it was so good. I was just reflecting on yesterday about this time we were talking, and it seems very silly because it's self-evident, but I think sometimes the most self-evident things can just have visceral dimensionality of inviting and forcing the self to confront some of the most difficult things in all of their complexity. And we were thinking about kind of post-war, post-World War II, how that changed the spatial geographies of many parts of the United States, particularly the cities that are kind of 100 to 200 miles north of and south of New York City. We're thinking about Robert Moses and both the construction of Lincoln Center and Central Park, but also bringing I-95 and others to cut off what had been not just Native and First Nation hunting grounds from the sea, but had been the livelihood of these civilizations for centuries, and now a place like Newark, New Haven, are cut off from the water, right? And that sense of the moving of bodies, goods, services up and down the I-95 corridor. But what does that do for the lived memory of the people who were there, who were forced to leave? And now we have the gridded and non-gridded parts of, say, New York City, and all of its heterogeneity completely uprooted. Yeah. And this point of almost kind of like a mythos of this is what causes the American dream. This is what causes this national ideology around who we are and what we do. And it's like, no, that's not who we were. That's not historical fact. But it is historic myth made concrete. And so the idea of this incredible project, kind of Studio South Zero, this kind of modular, solar-powered tool, vehicle to move you, to meet with other people, to see other spaces, to invite people in to have those conversations, so that all of the languages are changed, so that the histories that are recorded in the semiotic flow of words and meaning begin to start to have affinities in the ways that the disciplines have always had affinities with each other. It's quite beautiful and striking. Thank you. You teach at the Yale School of Art. And I'm wondering what that pedagogical aspect to your days, what it gives, what's generous about that, and what's really hard about that.
So, since I've been there, I've done different things. I've taught classes, I've been a critic, I've been a visiting, I've been a core. And so what's great about working under Anoka Farouk is that I've been able to really evolve as an artist in a very short period of time, and even with mistakes, have that pedagogical system sort of understand, embrace, and encourage me to move as an artist. So I would say, first and foremost, the humans there, my colleagues and my students, and that is a kind of ecological system that when I hear the goings on, both in the studio and in the pit, for everybody who knows the pit, it's the knowledge is endless in that space, right? The ways in which people think about both the history of paintings, conditions of paintings, the history of kind of formal shifts in paintings, conceptual spaces, conceptual leaps, disagreements, agreements, different perceptions around material. So all those things are really interesting to me because and all of us, I think about painting in very different ways. So my preoccupation isn't necessarily the history of painting as a field. It's sort of the history of painting moves, right? And how those moves by artists set up a new condition of knowledge for them. So that's what gets me going back to those art history holes, not the phenomenological condition of painting as a history and a form, but the individuals who make up that culture. If I think about them and the moves that they make within their practices, then I can exist in the institution with a lot of urgency, right? So I don't just believe painting, right? I don't think it's this magical kind of thing. I think they're human beings that make that culture of the image. And I think the human beings made sacred the rectangle. But I think that that's funny, that someone can say, oh, the rectangle is just a sacred space. And I'm like, is it? Because it's, but, when Catherine Murphy says that, you believe it because it's Catherine Murphy, but you don't go by that, So it's sometimes it's fun to hear those kinds of histories, and it's also fun to hear. So anyway, I love it. It's great. What can I say? I have to slow down, but I do love it. Yeah.
That sense of kind of helping someone to understand. It's great to attend to something that someone made, but it's not sacred. Investigate it. Go deeply. What are the moves they're making? Yeah, try it out for size. Does it work? Does it not work?
Yeah, but see, I think it's special that she thinks that's true, right? I think that, understanding that that is a true belief and how that is sort of proliferated in history, I think that's interesting. It's not my priority to dismantle. It's really not interesting unless she thinks it's interesting to me, right? That kind of mode of obsession. I'm obsessed that she's obsessed, so I'm obsessed with her, not with the rectangle. But it's a really, I'm obsessed with the square, not the rectangle. You know what I mean? I'm obsessed with the move of the square, not that it was on canvas.
it is time to open up for a few questions, should people have some. Yes, please.
Hi.
Please stand.
It's hard to hear, so please do stand.
So please stand and project.
The thing that strikes me about smoke is how polished and restrained it is. Like it's not weathered, because I think it's designed for the interior space as opposed to one of Smith's outdoor sculptures. And thinking about the Smith in relation to the paintings, can you talk about the finishes in your work? Because even in like the very seeming hard edges, there's drips, there's scratches, there's certain parts that have a gloss, and it's also like behind this surface. I wonder if you can talk about some of that.
Sure. I think that smoke only it's anything but restraint. You know, it's like this thing where the way it moves, right, in space, and the way it uses space as form, and that kind of both full and emptiness simultaneously, that composition is completely expressive, right? I think it's anything but a kind of restraint. I think it's a kind of push in a firm and a steady push, right, in a single direction, that then produces a kind of scalar condition, right? It holds itself so full of expressivity for me. But I understand, you know, what you're asking, right? What does it mean to see a hand, and what does it mean to not see a hand? And it's more important for me to see a thought, right? And that the hand or not the hand in this contemporary moment has been sort of flushed out. So in my mind, this idea of the expressive versus the kind of distilled, the industrial versus the poetic. So in my mind, I'm making work that is about that tension. It's like when the pipeline that is very much a steel, sometimes a steel piece of matter, like runs through the ground, right? There's that meeting up of surface that could not have been, the knowledge of that when he started with Throne wasn't a cultural condition at the time. So, and the knowledge of that in relationship to even a Donald Judd's work, and the kind of metallics, the kind of understanding of the conditions of climate and material, and the sort of hyper development, and what that would mean in terms of, greenhouse gas, even though there were so many people dealing with environmental politics at that time. But as a, artistic project, these things are, I think, for me, the questions of surface now, how to bring those things together, both the hand and the poetic, or the move, or the kind of human action, right? So for me, it's those all the work kinds of exist, like if smoke had sweat, right? Like if smoke had sweat, what would that look like? Well, now smoke does have sweat. Soot does have sweat. So how do we make, in the lineage of painting, what do those paintings look like to me? So I'm trying to think about that as a way to also think about the future. But I am interested in that tension between the two. But it's interesting, when you stand next to those objects, you can still, now we know it's a spray gun. You know what I mean? We know in our minds how that surface got there, right? We know the material and the industrial condition it takes to a thing,
Yeah.
you know?
But it's funny because the smoke sculpture is like wiped down every day and kept so polished because it's like a permanent piece within LACMA's collection as opposed to those outdoor ones that chip and fade over time.
But they could solve that simply, right? They could solve that so simply, but it's the you know, it's the same thing with plexiglass. The horror of like black plexi in an interior space is the air, right? The dust, the particles, right? So if you're tending any object like that, you have to wipe it down every day, right? To keep it that clean. So those plexi surfaces in that space have to be sprayed, and that's nowhere near what smoke is. I'm just not there yet, but it still has to be tended to. Unless on purpose it collects, like that's David Hammond's, like the purpose of collecting the dust, right? Or the time passing.
Is there another? Well, if there's not, can I make just a penultimate? Yes, please. Yes.
I wanted to ask you, like, how you would categorize yourself out of art. Like, if you would consider yourself, like a black artist, or how you feel about that categorization.
Can you repeat the question for us?
Yes, the question was, and please fill in, I want to make sure that I get it, it was rich and layered. How do you categorize yourself as an artist? And one of the examples given for Torkwase to conjure and think about was a black artist. How does that make you feel? How do you characterize yourself? Is that a characterization that feels comfortable? Is that correct?
Well, I think that that's an interesting question, in that we assume that we know what blackness is, right? And assuming that I accept blackness of a condition that's ongoing, right, or unfixed, and assuming that the history of that question has polarized people. And so the answer to that question is that I am a person who is interested in understanding to an extent the project of being racialized and erased. And out of that comes the sort of what we understand of blackness is, and very much interested and invested in, you know, how that makes me see the world, and how that lives on my flesh and my body, and how I then have to navigate because I'm interested in that, the production of that, right? So, yes and no. Sometimes it holds up, and sometimes it just doesn't. Sometimes it's very much adequate, and sometimes it's not. So it's not a binary of where this idea of identity is kind of I am a part of a constructed condition in a globalized, racialized space, but I am a part of its slipperiness, and when it falls apart, and when it needs to be held really tight.